I never believed in ghosts until I stepped inside a cell where time had frozen. What I saw that night changed me for...
She won't stop crying.
Do you believe a place can absorb pain? That stone can cry?
Imagine being locked in a concrete box for 43 years, alone.
Welcome back to another chilling episode. Tonight, we're venturing into the darkest corners of American history, where justice turned to torment, and the echoes of suffering still linger in cold stone corridors. Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Once hailed as the most famous and expensive prison in the world, this fortress of solitude has become something far more sinister. Built in 1829, it pioneered the concept of solitary confinement, complete isolation designed to make prisoners reflect on their crimes and find redemption through penitence. But something went terribly wrong within these walls. The isolation that was meant to heal minds instead broke them. And now, nearly a century after its closure, visitors and staff report encounters that defy explanation. Shadowy figures wandering the cell blocks, disembodied voices pleading for freedom, and an overwhelming sense of despair that seems to seep from the very stones themselves. Tonight, I'll share 3 documented supernatural encounters from Eastern State Penitentiary, stories that will make you question everything you think you know about death, justice, and what remains when both have long passed. But before we begin our descent into darkness, make sure to check the pinned comment below this video. You'll find a link to our exclusive ebook containing dozens more terrifying true stories that didn't make it into this episode. These bonus tales will keep you awake long after this video ends. Now, dim the lights and let's step through the iron gates of America's most haunted prison. It was October 15th, 2003, when paranormal investigator Marcus Rodriguez first set foot in Eastern State Penitentiary. He'd spent years documenting supernatural activity in supposedly haunted locations across the country, but nothing had prepared him for what he would encounter in cell block 6. Marcus wasn't alone that night. He was accompanied by Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychologist researching the long-term effects of solitary confinement, and Tommy Walsh, a former corrections officer who had volunteered to guide them through the prison's labyrinthine layout. The plan was simple: spend the night in cell block 6, the section of the prison where some of the most violent and mentally unstable prisoners had been held. They would document any unusual activity using electromagnetic field detectors, digital audio recorders, and thermal cameras. What they discovered would change their understanding of the paranormal forever. The investigation begins. Cell block 6 had been closed to the public for renovations, making it the perfect location for their investigation. The block consisted of 32 cells arranged along a central corridor, with each cell measuring exactly 8 feet by 10 feet, barely larger than a modern bathroom. As they entered the block at 9 p.m., the temperature immediately dropped by 15 degrees. Tommy, who had worked in prisons for over 20 years, noticed it first. "That's not normal," he whispered, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. "Even in winter, these blocks hold heat from the day. Something's not right here." Marcus began setting up his equipment, while Dr. Chen took notes on the psychological atmosphere of the space. The oppressive nature of the cells was immediately apparent. Even knowing they could leave at any time, the investigators felt an overwhelming sense of claustrophobia and despair. But it was when Marcus activated his electromagnetic field detector that things took a disturbing turn. The first contact. At 10:17 p.m., the EMF detector began registering massive spikes in electromagnetic activity. The readings were unlike anything Marcus had seen before. Not the steady, consistent readings typically associated with electrical interference, but erratic, almost frantic fluctuations that seemed to follow a pattern. "It's like Morse code, Doctor," Chen observed, watching the device's LED display flash in rapid bursts. Tommy had moved ahead of the group, examining the cells one by one with his flashlight. Suddenly, his light beam stopped moving. "Guys," his voice was barely a whisper, "you need to see this." Marcus and Dr. Chen hurried to where Tommy stood frozen outside cell 23. What they saw defied rational explanation. Inside the cell, clearly visible despite the absence of any light source, was the silhouette of a man sitting on the edge of the concrete bed. The figure was completely black, as if cut from the darkness itself, but its outline was perfectly defined against the gray stone walls. "Is someone in there?" Dr. Chen called out, her professional composure beginning to crack. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't even acknowledge their presence. It simply sat there, motionless, radiating an aura of profound sadness that seemed to fill the entire corridor. Marcus raised his thermal camera, but the screen showed only the cold, empty cell. According to his equipment, nothing was there. Yet all three investigators could clearly see the shadowy figure. The revelation. For 20 minutes, they watched the shadow in complete silence. Then, without warning, it stood up and began walking toward the cell door. As it moved, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees, and their EMF detector went haywire, registering readings so high they were off the scale. The shadow stopped directly in front of them, separated only by the cell's iron bars. Though it had no visible features, all three investigators felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched, studied, judged. Then it spoke. The voice that emerged from the shadow was unlike anything they had ever heard. It wasn't heard through their ears, but seemed to resonate directly in their minds. A desperate, pleading whisper that bypassed their auditory system entirely. "I didn't mean to kill her," the voice said. "I didn't mean to kill my little girl." Dr. Chen gasped, recognizing the psychological profile immediately. "Tommy, who was in cell 23? What was he in for?" Tommy's face had gone pale. He fumbled for his notes, hands shaking as he read, "Daniel Morrison, prisoner number 2847, convicted of child murder in 1923, spent 43 years in solitary confinement, died in this cell in 1966. The shadow seemed to react to the mention of the name. It pressed against the bars, and for a moment its featureless face seemed to gain definition. Hollow eyes, gaunt cheeks, a mouth twisted in eternal anguish. "She wouldn't stop crying," the voice continued, growing more desperate. "The baby wouldn't stop crying, and I was so tired, so angry. I just wanted her to sleep. I just shook her a little. I didn't know it would." The investigators stood transfixed as the full horror of what they were witnessing became clear. They weren't just seeing a ghost. They were experiencing the eternal torment of a man who had spent over 4 decades reliving the worst moment of his life, trapped in a cycle of guilt and remorse that death couldn't break. The final encounter. The shadow began to pace back and forth in the cell, its movements becoming more agitated with each step. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming on the iron bars. "I tried to tell them," the voice pleaded. "I tried to tell the guards, the warden, anyone who would listen. It was an accident. I loved my daughter. I would never hurt her on purpose." Dr. Chen, drawing on her psychological training, stepped closer to the cell. "Daniel," she said softly, "we believe you. We know you didn't mean to hurt her." The shadow stopped pacing and turned toward her voice. "You've been punished enough," she continued. 43 years in this cell, and how many more years after death? Your daughter would want you to find peace." For a moment, the shadow seemed to shimmer, and the investigators caught a glimpse of the man Daniel Morrison had been, young, frightened, broken by grief and guilt. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow began to fade. The temperature gradually returned to normal, and the EMF readings dropped to 0. but just before it disappeared entirely, they heard one final whisper, "Tell them I'm sorry. Tell them I'm so very sorry." The aftermath. The three investigators left cell block 6 at dawn, forever changed by what they had witnessed. Marcus had captured hours of audio recordings, though most contained only static and the investigators' own voices. The thermal camera had recorded nothing unusual, but Dr. Chen's psychological evaluation of the encounter proved the most disturbing. According to historical records she later uncovered, Daniel Morrison had indeed been imprisoned for the accidental death of his infant daughter. He had maintained his innocence until his death, claiming the child's death was the result of shaken baby syndrome, a condition not widely understood or accepted by the courts in 1923. He had spent 43 years in cell 23, slowly losing his sanity to guilt, isolation, and the knowledge that no one believed his story, the most chilling detail. Prison records showed that Morrison had been found dead in his cell on October 15, 1966, exactly 37 years to the day before the investigators' encounter. To this day, cell block 6 remains one of the most active paranormal locations in Eastern State Penitentiary. Visitors frequently report seeing the shadow figure, and many leave the block feeling an overwhelming sense of sadness and remorse, emotions that aren't their own. Daniel Morrison's spirit, it seems, continues his sentence, trapped forever in a prison of his own guilt, and the justice system's inability to recognize the difference between accident and intent. A different kind of prisoner. Eastern State Penitentiary housed more than just common criminals during its 142 years of operation. Among its most notable inmates was Dr. Evan Chandler, a respected surgeon who had fallen from grace in the most spectacular way possible. In 1892, Dr. Chandler had been one of Philadelphia's most prominent physicians. He operated a successful practice, owned a mansion on Rittenhouse Square, and was married to the daughter of a wealthy industrialist. But beneath his polished exterior lurked a darkness that would ultimately destroy everything he held dear. Dr. Chandler had developed an addiction to morphine, originally prescribed to him following a surgical accident that left him with chronic pain. As his addiction worsened, he began stealing morphine from his own medical practice, eventually leading to the death of several patients who were given lethal doses of the drug. But it wasn't medical malpractice that landed him in Eastern State. It was what he did to feed his addiction when his medical supply ran out. The crimes that shocked Philadelphia. Between 1890 and 1892, Philadelphia was terrorized by a series of gruesome murders. 5 wealthy patients of various doctors throughout the city were found dead in their homes, their bodies bearing the precise surgical incisions of someone with extensive medical knowledge. The victims had all been given what appeared to be legitimate medical treatments, but post-mortem examinations revealed they had been deliberately overdosed with morphine, then dissected while still alive to harvest their organs, which were sold on the black market to other physicians for medical research. The Philadelphia police were baffled. The murders were too precise, too clinical to be the work of a common criminal. They were dealing with someone who possessed advanced medical knowledge and surgical skills. Dr. Chandler's downfall came when one of his victims, Mrs. Elizabeth Hartford, survived his attack. She had been partially conscious during the procedure and was able to identify him before succumbing to her injuries 3 days later. When police searched his home, they found a fully equipped surgical suite in the basement, complete with stolen medical instruments, bottles of morphine, and preserved human organs floating in jars of formaldehyde. Life in cell block 4. Dr. Chandler was sentenced to life imprisonment and was housed in cell block 4, in a cell specially modified to prevent him from harming himself or others. The warden, recognizing the unique danger Chandler posed, had his cell stripped of anything that could be fashioned into a medical instrument, but prison records from that era reveal something disturbing about Dr. Chandler's incarceration. Despite being in solitary confinement, he continued to practice medicine within the prison walls. Guards reported finding detailed anatomical drawings carved into his cell walls. Other prisoners in the block complained of hearing surgical procedures being performed at night, the sound of metal instruments clinking together, muffled screams, and the wet sound of flesh being cut. When guards investigated these reports, they always found Dr. Chandler's cell empty, except for the man himself, sitting calmly on his bed with a serene smile on his face. The modern investigation. In 2018, paranormal investigator Elena Vasquez brought a team of researchers to Eastern State to investigate reports of supernatural activity in cell block 4. Elena specialized in cases involving spirits who seemed unable to accept their deaths, ghosts who continued to perform the activities they had been obsessed with in life. Her team included medical examiner Dr. James Morrison, historian Patricia Klein, and psychic medium Rebecca Santos. They had come to investigate claims that visitors to cell block 4 experienced vivid hallucinations of surgical procedures and often left the prison with unexplained injuries. Elena's investigation began at midnight on November 3rd, the anniversary of Dr. Chandler's death in 1923. The team set up their equipment in cell 31, where the doctor had spent his final 31 years. Within minutes of entering the cell, Dr. Morrison began experiencing severe chest pains and difficulty breathing. Rebecca, the psychic medium, immediately sensed a malevolent presence and urged the team to leave. But Elena was determined to document whatever was happening in the cell. She had Dr. Morrison wait outside while she, Patricia, and Rebecca continued the investigation. The phantom surgery. At 12:47 a.m., the temperature in the cell dropped dramatically, and the investigators began hearing sounds that defied explanation. Metal instruments clinked together in the darkness, accompanied by what sounded like medical equipment being moved around the small cell. Rebecca went into a trance-like state and began speaking in a voice that wasn't her own, the cultured, educated tone of a 19th century physician. "The patient is prepared," the voice said through Rebecca. "Pulse is weak, but steady. Morphine administered. Beginning the procedure now." Elena watched in horror as Rebecca's hands began moving in precise surgical motions, as if she were performing an operation on an invisible patient. Her movements were too precise, too professional to be random gestures. She was clearly following some kind of medical procedure. Patricia, meanwhile, was documenting the carved anatomical drawings on the cell walls that prison records had mentioned. But as she photographed them, the drawings seemed to move and change, showing different stages of surgical procedures as if they were animated medical textbooks. The unseen patient. The most disturbing part of the investigation came when Rebecca, still channeling Dr. Chandler's spirit, began interacting with what appeared to be an invisible patient. "Please don't struggle," she said in the doctor's voice. "The morphine will help with the pain. I need these organs more than you do. My withdrawal, you wouldn't understand. The pain is unbearable without the morphine." Eleanor realized with growing horror that they weren't just witnessing a residual haunting, a psychic recording of past events. They were experiencing an active haunting, where Dr. Chandler's spirit was continuing to perform phantom surgeries on phantom patients. The ghost was still killing, still feeding his addiction, still practicing his perverted version of medicine in death. The attack. At 1:15 a.m., Rebecca suddenly collapsed to the floor, writhing in agony. When Eleanor rushed to help her, she discovered something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Rebecca had developed a precise surgical incision along her abdomen, a cut so clean and straight it could only have been made by a skilled surgeon with a sharp scalpel. But there was no scalpel in the cell, and no one had touched her. Blood was pouring from the wound, and Rebecca was going into shock. Elena immediately called for Dr. Morrison, who rushed into the cell to provide emergency medical treatment. As he worked to stabilize Rebecca, Dr. Morrison reported feeling invisible hands guiding his movements, as if an unseen surgeon was directing the emergency procedure. He later described the sensation as having someone looking over his shoulder, correcting his technique and suggesting more efficient methods. The most chilling part, the invisible presence seemed disappointed that Dr. Morrison was healing rather than harming his patient. The escape and revelation. The investigation team rushed Rebecca to the hospital, where she required surgery to repair the mysterious wound. The attending surgeon, Dr. Marcus Webb, was baffled by the injury. This incision was made by someone with extensive surgical training, he told Elena. The precision is remarkable. It follows the exact path you would take to access the abdominal organs for transplant harvesting. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. But security cameras in the prison showed that no one had come near Rebecca with any kind of weapon or instrument. The wound had simply appeared on her body, as if cut by an invisible scalpel. During her recovery, Rebecca revealed what she had experienced while channeling Dr. Chandler's spirit. She had felt his overwhelming addiction, not just to morphine, but to the act of surgery itself. The ghost was trapped in an eternal cycle, forever performing operations to feed both his drug addiction and his psychological compulsion to cut into human flesh. He doesn't see patients as people, she explained. They're just collections of organs and tissues to be harvested. Death didn't cure his addiction, it made it worse because now he has an eternity to practice. The ongoing haunting. Since the 2018 investigation, Cell Block 4 has been closed to public tours. However, maintenance workers and security guards continue to report disturbing experiences in the area. Tools go missing and are later found arranged like surgical instruments. Visitors to other parts of the prison report feeling sudden, sharp pains in their abdomen or chest when passing near Block 4. And on quiet nights, staff members still report hearing the sound of surgical procedures coming from the empty cell. Most disturbing of all, several visitors to the prison have left with unexplained injuries. Small, precise cuts that appear without warning and heal with surgical precision. Medical examination of these wounds consistently shows the work of someone with advanced surgical training. Dr. Chandler's ghost, it seems, continues his practice from beyond the grave, treating the entire prison as his personal operating theater and every living person as a potential patient for his phantom surgeries. The irony is particularly cruel. A man who violated the sacred trust of the medical profession in life continues to pervert the healing arts in death, turning medicine into torture for all eternity. The breaking point, January 17th, 1961, was supposed to be just another cold winter day at Eastern State Penitentiary. The prison was operating at maximum capacity, housing 1,300 inmates in a facility designed for 500. Overcrowding had led to deteriorating conditions, increased violence, and mounting tension among both prisoners and guards. What happened that day would go down as one of the most violent prison riots in American history, and according to numerous witnesses, it's a riot that has never truly ended. The uprising began in Cell Block 8, sparked by a seemingly minor incident. During the morning meal, prisoner James Razor McKenna was served spoiled meat for the third consecutive day. When he complained, Guard Sergeant William Torres responded by striking him with a nightstick. McKenna, serving a life sentence for armed robbery and assault, had spent 8 years in Eastern State's harsh solitary confinement system. He had reached his breaking point. What started as a one-on-one fight between McKenna and Torres quickly escalated when other prisoners in the dining hall began throwing their meal trays at the guards. Within minutes, the entire dining hall erupted in chaos. The violence spreads. Prison records from that day paint a picture of unimaginable violence. As word of the riot spread through the prison, inmates in every cell block began staging their own uprisings. Guards who had served at Eastern State for decades later described it as the closest thing to hell they had ever witnessed. The prisoners had fashioned weapons from eating utensils, bed springs, and anything else they could find. They overpowered the guards in multiple blocks, seized their keys, and began releasing other inmates from their cells. But this wasn't just a typical prison riot driven by demands for better conditions or early release. The years of solitary confinement, psychological torture, and dehumanizing treatment had pushed many of the inmates beyond rational thought. They weren't just rebelling, they were seeking revenge. Guard Captain Robert Hayes, and who survived the riot, later testified that the prisoners weren't trying to escape. They were hunting guards and weaker inmates, inflicting the same brutal treatment they had endured for years. The massacre in Block 8. The worst of the violence occurred in Cell Block 8, where the riot had begun. Led by James McKenna, a group of the most violent inmates had barricaded themselves in the block with 17 guards and prison staff members as hostages. For 6 hours, authorities negotiated with McKenna and his followers. The inmates' demands were simple but impossible to meet. They wanted the warden and the prison's chief psychiatrist to enter the block unarmed to answer for the torture they had inflicted through the solitary confinement system. When negotiations broke down at 6 p.m., McKenna made good on his threats. According to the sole surviving guard from Block 8, McKenna and his followers began systematically murdering their hostages. But these weren't quick deaths. The inmates took their time, using improvised torture devices to inflict maximum pain and suffering. Sergeant Torres, whose beating of McKenna had sparked the riot, was found with over 40 stab wounds inflicted by a sharpened spoon handle. The prison chaplain had been crucified against the cell block wall, using bed springs as nails. 2 guards had been beaten to death with their own nightsticks. By the time state police stormed the block at 8 p.m., 13 guards and 4 inmates were dead, with dozens more injured. McKenna himself was found in cell 47, having apparently taken his own life rather than face capture. The supernatural aftermath. The riot officially ended on January 18, 1961, but according to dozens of witnesses over the past 6 decades, the violence in Cell Block 8 has never truly stopped. Within weeks of the riot's end, guards working the night shift began reporting disturbing phenomena in Block 8. They heard the sounds of fighting, screams, the impact of improvised weapons against flesh, and the desperate pleas of hostages begging for their lives. When guards investigated these sounds, they consistently found the block empty and quiet, but the smell of blood and violence lingered in the air, so strong that many guards refused to enter the block alone. The first documented supernatural encounter occurred on March 15, 1961, just 2 months after the riot. Night guard Thomas Sullivan was making his rounds when he heard sounds of a struggle coming from cell 47, the cell where James McKenna had died. When Sullivan approached the cell, he saw 2 figures engaged in brutal combat. One was clearly McKenna, tall, muscular, with the distinctive scar across his left cheek that had earned him his nickname, Razor. The other figure was harder to identify, but appeared to be wearing a guard's uniform. Sullivan watched in horror as the phantom McKenna repeatedly stabbed the ghostly guard with what appeared to be a sharpened spoon handle. The guard's screams echoed through the cell block, so realistic that Sullivan called for backup. When other guards arrived, the cell was empty, but the concrete floor was covered with what appeared to be fresh blood that vanished when they tried to photograph it. The investigation of 2019. In October 2019, paranormal researcher Dr. Michael Harrison assembled a team to investigate the ongoing supernatural activity in Cell Block 8. Harrison specialized in residual hauntings, supernatural phenomena caused by traumatic events that leave permanent psychic imprints on locations. His team included forensic psychologist Dr. Amanda Ross, former corrections officer Vincent Elam III Pez, and documentary filmmaker Sarah Chen. They had obtained special permission to spend 3 nights in Block 8, with the goal of documenting and understanding the supernatural activity. Dr. Harrison's theory was that the extreme violence and emotional trauma of the riot had created what he called a psychic loop, a supernatural recording that played over and over again, trapping the spirits of both the rioters and their victims in an eternal cycle of violence. What they discovered was far worse than a simple residual haunting. Night 1, the reenactment. The team entered Cell Block 8 at 9 p.m. on October 17th, 2019. They had set up cameras throughout the block and planned to monitor the situation from a safe distance. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the time when the riot had been at its most violent in 1961, the temperature in the block dropped by 20 degrees, and the investigators began hearing sounds that matched historical accounts of the uprising. The sounds of fighting filled the air. Metal striking metal, flesh hitting concrete, screams of pain and rage. But when the investigators checked their video monitors, the cameras showed empty cells and corridors. Vincent III Pez, drawing on his experience as a corrections officer, immediately recognized the tactical significance of what they were hearing. "That's not random violence," he told the team. "They're following the same pattern as the original riot, securing the exits first, then moving systematically through each cell." Dr. Ross monitored the team's psychological state and noted that all 4 investigators were experiencing elevated stress levels, increased heart rate, and heightened aggression, as if the psychic energy of the riot was affecting their own emotional state. The phantom prisoners. At 12:30 a.m., the investigators witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about ghosts and hauntings. Through their night vision cameras, they could see translucent figures moving through the cell block. But these weren't peaceful spirits or residual images. These phantom prisoners were actively engaging in violence, fighting with invisible guards, torturing unseen victims, and reenacting the brutality of the original riot with terrifying accuracy. The lead figure was unmistakably James McKenna. Even in death, his presence dominated the cell block. He moved with purpose and intelligence, directing other phantom inmates in their attacks and coordinating the supernatural riot with the same tactical skill he had displayed in life. But the most disturbing aspect of what they witnessed was that the phantom McKenna seemed aware of the investigators' presence. He would occasionally look directly at their cameras, his ghostly face twisted with the same rage and hatred that had driven him to violence in life. The attack on the living. On their second night in the cell block, the investigators experienced something unprecedented in paranormal research. They became victims of the phantom riot themselves. At 1:15 a.m., Dr. Harrison was monitoring the cameras when he was suddenly struck by an invisible force. Security footage later showed him being lifted off the ground and thrown against the cell block wall by something that didn't appear on camera. Vincent III Pez rushed to help Harrison, but was immediately attacked by what felt like multiple invisible assailants. He later described being punched, kicked, and beaten by phantom prisoners who seemed determined to make him pay for his years as a corrections officer. Dr. Ross and Sarah Chen tried to retreat from the cell block, but found their exit blocked by an invisible barrier. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began forming on the walls and bars as the supernatural violence escalated. The most terrifying moment came when they heard James McKenna's voice, not through their recording equipment, but spoken directly into their ears with crystal clarity. "You want to know what it's like to be caged like animals? Now you'll find out." The endless riot. The investigators managed to escape the cell block at dawn, but their experience had lasting effects. Dr. Harrison required hospitalization for injuries that appeared to have been inflicted by multiple attackers, despite the fact that security cameras showed no one else in the cell block. Vincent III Pez developed severe PTSD and retired from paranormal investigation permanently. He later stated that the phantom prisoners had somehow accessed his memories of working in corrections and used that knowledge against him, making him feel the fear and helplessness that prisoners experience. Dr. Ross's psychological evaluation of the incident concluded that they had encountered what she termed active malevolent entities, spirits that retained their personalities, memories, and violent tendencies from life, but were now powered by decades of accumulated rage and hatred. The documentary footage Sarah Chen captured became some of the most compelling evidence of supernatural activity ever recorded, but it was so disturbing that it has never been released to the public, and Chen herself refuses to discuss what she witnessed that night. The eternal sentence cell Block 8 remains closed to the public, but the riot continues every night. Guards and maintenance workers report that the sounds of violence are getting stronger and more frequent, as if the phantom uprising is gaining power over time. The most chilling aspect of this ongoing haunting is that it appears to be expanding. Supernatural activity has been reported in adjacent cell blocks, suggesting that the phantom riot is spreading throughout the prison. James McKenna and his followers, it seems, have found a way to continue their rebellion against the prison system from beyond the grave. They are serving an eternal sentence in Eastern State Penitentiary, not as prisoners, but as the perpetual executors of their own violent justice. And according to the most recent reports from prison staff, the phantom prisoners are no longer content to simply reenact the violence of 1961. They're actively recruiting new spirits to join their cause, turning Eastern State Penitentiary into a supernatural prison where the dead continue to wage war against the living. The riot that began on January 17th of 1961 may never truly end, because in death, James McKenna and his followers have found the ultimate way to ensure that their rebellion against the system will continue for all eternity. As our journey through the haunted halls of Eastern State Penitentiary comes to an end, we're left with three chilling tales that demonstrate how the deepest human traumas can transcend death itself. We witnessed Daniel Morrison, trapped forever in cell block 6, endlessly reliving the guilt of his daughter's accidental death, a man whose punishment continues long after justice should have been served. We encountered Dr. Evan Chandler, whose addiction and perverse medical practices have transformed him into a phantom surgeon, continuing to practice his deadly craft on unsuspecting victims from beyond the grave. And we experienced the ongoing riot led by James McKenna, proving that some rebellions are so fueled by rage and injustice that not even death can end them. These stories serve as a haunting reminder that Eastern State Penitentiary was more than just a prison. It was a laboratory for human suffering, where the line between justice and torture became so blurred that it created wounds in reality itself. The prison closed its doors in 1971, but the spirits within its walls continue to serve their sentences. They remain trapped not by iron bars and stone walls, but by guilt, addiction, rage, and the unfinished business of lives, cut short by violence and despair. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of these encounters is that they suggest death is not the end of suffering, that in some cases, it's just the beginning of an eternal sentence in a prison of one's own making. Before you go, remember to check that pinned comment below this video. Our exclusive ebook contains dozens more true terror stories that will keep you awake long after the lights go out. These bonus tales explore haunted locations around the world, each with their own dark secrets and restless spirits. Thank you for joining me on this descent into darkness. If these stories have left you wanting more, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the shadows hold many more secrets, and we're just getting started. Until next time, remember, some prisons never truly release their inmates, and some sentences last for eternity. Sweet dreams.